Can I throw this? Would anyone like to kick us off with a question? Otherwise, I have, as always, several. But would anyone like to start? Please, Greg.
Thanks very much to all the presenters for an enthralling and diversely interesting way to start the whole event. Maria, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about these fascinating slippers. Firstly, it seems to me that you sound like you've resolved the question of whether they might have actually come from Victoria, and you're satisfied that they're from La Perouse. I wonder whether you've had anyone attempt to identify the species of shellfish and whether they correspond to those that are available in the La Perouse area, because that to me would seem to settle that, and you didn't mention that. Yes, sorry.
Thanks, Greg. So I think, mention that I think what needs to happen is some serious sort of object analysis to compare, say, that example with images of other shell work to see if we can identify makers, but I think also identify shells. I guess, and that sort of work, I don't know, maybe we'd call it connoisseurship or something, doesn't always happen so much, but I think it needs to be done. So I would want to put that alongside also this much more broader social, kind of historical kind of understanding of the objects. If they are Victorian, from Victoria, then I think that's really interesting as well, because I think I suggested that there's lots of accounts of the Duchess being given gifts for the baby, including a little kind of Noah's Ark in which Noah and his wife, Aboriginal people, and all the animals are native animals. There's little tea sets, little dresses. But we don't actually, there's not, that I can see yet, and it might turn up, an account of the shell objects being given. So if they are Victoria, that would take us into another realm to sort of work out how they came into the possession of the Duchess. So, but I have to say, and I've asked, Gay and others, that there's not a sense that shell work was made in Victoria, but I might be wrong. I would have thought maybe Lake Tyers. But I think possibly they're moving through these women's organisations, so they could be already anywhere in Australia. So that mobility that people are talking about, I think, has to be what circuits are they moving through internally as well as sort of out of the country. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sure.
So I was so interested that the slip of cardboard that identified the children's booties were kept inserted into it, and your analysis of the way that it was represented in the media as sort of being given as a gift, and that act of transference was the thing that created its meaning. And I wondered if you had any comments about that piece of card and how it had been preserved.
So I think that's really interesting. I think in addition to doing shell research, we probably need to do handwriting research to see if it's the Duchess's handwriting. And if it is, then I have another kind of theory about how it came into her possession, which may have been through the people who were hosting her in Sydney, which includes Lady de Chair, the wife of the governor, who's very involved in Sydney art circles and also women's groups, and actually opens Margaret Preston's 1929 exhibition. So we have sort of those interlocking. So I wondered whether or not the little piece of paper was written by the Duchess, which may suggest that there's a kind of intimate association that someone's given it to her. So we'd have to sort of have a look to see how the other pieces are documented. I can't find any more of the objects that are recorded being given to her up on the online database at the moment. And then I think they just, that piece of paper stays with them, because I don't think the booties ever, once they move from 145 Piccadilly into Buckingham Palace, I don't think they ever move again until Rachel Peat opens the cupboard and brings them out. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank the panellists again. That was a really interesting start. And I was drawing a thread across what you were saying, and it strikes me that in any sort of modern curatorial endeavour, whether it be at Inverell or Harvard Uni or Buckingham Palace, that there's this desire to reanimate or remediate what these displaced objects are trying to say now. And so I guess my question is, does the use value of the object have any bearing on the voice of that object now? Because I'm thinking about the shoes in particular. The Coolum one, I imagine, had years and years of use, as evidenced through the patina and the workmanship. The booties, I don't know if you've had anything to do with children, but booties, rarely survive more than one outing, and the fact that there are still two of them, I think, is remarkable. I wonder if they've ever graced a baby's foot. So, and I wonder whether any Indigenous artist would have put them on her child's foot. So, yeah, does the use value of the object determine its value in speaking to us now?
I think my form of curation that I perform is really about thinking less about the preservation about objects and more about the activation of objects. So thinking about their use within lifeways. So one of the things that I was thinking about is that idea of touch and use, and imagining a kind of a speculation that maybe a baby was cradled in these objects, and that for me is something quite meaningful, because in many ways the subjecthood of those objects have been evacuated, and so really insisting on that personhood, that subjecthood of the objects is, I think, a way to expand our understanding of the significance of those objects, and then also allows us to think about the homing desires of those objects as well, that they once belonged, and in many ways they still belong to people. So thinking about that tension, and that tension doesn't go away.
I think that's a really interesting question for me. And so part of what I was trying to argue in my paper is to understand the sort of the cultural value of this bed. We need to think about it across multiple time periods. If we only think about it in the present, its value is considerably diminished through very practical considerations. So it's a double bed, which nobody wants to sleep in anymore. So because 19th century furniture is generally smaller than furniture that is made in the 21st century, so that it doesn't have high sort of economic value. And when I spoke to a variety of dealers in San Francisco, it would be worth considerably less now than it was when it was made. And you could probably buy furniture at IKEA for more than you would buy this bedroom suite for. So that there are practical considerations about that. The people that own it, Joe and Digby McNeil, intend to maintain its use, and that see that as an important part of its function, that people will continue to sleep in it. And they even have the original mattress that came with it that was made in 1906, but they've taken it out of the tester and they've just they've put a modern mattress in it. But it's an extremely important consideration, because the object really has been used since it was made, and connecting, and I suppose that's the title of my paper, connecting all of those people that have used it is the thing that actually generates its substantial history. And if we separate those out, then we can't really have a full understanding of what this object may mean.
Just add a little bit there. The use value, I think, of the shell shoes is not to be worn, but to be gifted. I think that's or bought or sold. But also I think they are fundamentally an object of desire. And so I think that's what I was trying to get to in the paper, that very sort of obsessive focus on the Duchess's separation. The shoes sort of take on all of those sort of meanings around the absent child in the way that any little baby object sort of does. I think now about the National Museum of Australia's collection of Azaria Chamberlain objects. So they're full of, sort of pathos. And I think that's what they're working, and that we need to sort of get into these desires, and particularly I'm just trying to get into an idea of white women's desires and a sense of longing. And so I think their preservation, in a way, is that they're put away. That's what they're used for, to be put away, to be a sort of a memory object. What I guess I'm kind of concerned about is that now they're going to be mobilised for a very different kind of political project, which is not really true to, I think, their origins, but I wouldn't want to kind of also emphasise their origins. But I do think that a whole lot of stuff gets dropped out if we don't sort of keep that in mind. So they're very much a kind of an object of longing, I think. But who's longing? Yeah.
Thank you so much for those wonderful papers. What a wonderful way to kick off proceedings today. And I have a question that deals with the tactile engagement with these objects. Now, of course, Mark, your bed is still used and very easy to access. It's in a home that's open to the public. And so I guess my question is for Maria and Stephen about these objects, which are of great cultural value, are old, are fragile, but the kind of problematics of display in terms of how to reactivate their kind of, the necessary kind of tangibility of them. They were made in both cases in a very kind of tactile, hands-on, productive manner, shell assemblage, and obviously the coulamon, you can still almost see the imprints, it seems, in many ways. So I was curious to know if you have any kind of ideas about strategies of reactivating these objects through actual touching, and I know the problematics involved therein because of their fragility. With, of course, communities from which they come, to which they belong, but also perhaps with a larger museum audience. And one of the things that made me ask this question is because there was an exhibition a few years ago, I think at the British Museum, on relics. And they actually had to put vitrines on the relics in display in the museum because people were coming up and kissing them because these objects were made, have had a long history of being engaged with in a very physical, tactile manner. So yes, I was wondering your thoughts about tactility and strategies for enhancing reconnection, actual physical reconnection.
I mean, I think that's one of the difficult things to do with historic collections, and as a curator you do sometimes are allowed to touch objects, and you can also encourage other people to, when the conservators hovering nearby, touch objects. But we have to remember that touch is relational and touch is conditional. And I also borrowed some objects, some pearl shell objects from the Kimberley, and I was given permission to use them, but they weren't allowed to be touched by women. So they're also, there are protocols in terms of who can touch objects. I was kind of dissatisfied with having to place many of the objects under glass cases. I also borrowed a work from the Metropolitan, which was this beautiful 19th century Torres Strait drum, and a drum is about the sound it produces. But also at the same time, it kind of is about the museumification of those objects as well. So it kind of tries to intervene into that history, but it's a bit of a failure as well. But that idea of touch is really important because it is about the power of those objects. And not everyone has access to touching those objects. I remember when I was working at the NGV and we had visiting artists come, and sometimes artists would want to touch the paintings of their ancestors, their fathers and mothers. And those paintings were not just illustrations of place, they were real-time communion with place. And so thinking about the kind of extra discursive significations of works, I think, is really interesting, and why that touch is, mediated through Indigenous forms of curation.
So I can't say that I've sort of been thinking curatorial about these objects, and you saw one of the photographs where we did have the privilege of going sort of into Buckingham Palace to see them when we wore gloves. But I guess one of the concerns probably have is that the Royal Collection basically is a private collection, nothing will go out of it, and digitisation is what they are doing. So I mentioned just very briefly that, if you read all the annual reports, which for some reason I've been doing, they're saying that digitisation is the way that they want to make their material more publicly available. And there's some, kind of quite sweet statements from the director about how this opens it, takes away curatorial authority and allows the kind of curious visitor to re-look at the art in the collection, but it will be from a distance, I imagine, through digitisation as their means for access. And I don't know what that means because...
If I can ask, separate from the unique example in Buckingham Palace, the kind of ways that shell work is being displayed in contemporary institutions here.
Yeah, well, actually, I always go back. I did my first work in the 80s, and I always go back to the Powerhouse Museum's exhibition where Anne and Peter did shell working workshops on the weekends. We're talking, 1987, 1988. I think it's in some ways kind of, was at the forefront there, and that was very powerful. That, one of the other questions is, and I guess I've been reading a bit of Susan Stewart, but, a lot of the shell work now is also in the museum gift shops. So that's kind of one way in which it's moving around. I have to say, sort of the way you can tell I'm answering this question is I haven't been following the exhibition and display of shell work in contemporary galleries of late. Yeah. But I'm kind of written on its exhibition.
Maybe I could just add also that, touch is just one sense, that we have to activate. And thinking about, there are many others, the different philosophies of perception as well. So, not that we want everyone to lick works, but, that there are, in art history we emphasise the visual, to the detriment of other senses.
Mark, do you want to address? Would you like to address that question also?
Well, it does smell like walnut when you go into the room. That's absolutely the case. But Stephen, I was so interested in what you said about the idea of the failure of the curatorial environment to be able to provide that. But that's something really important to note as a phase of the life of the object. And there's, in material culture studies, there are these big debates about, I suppose, appropriate uses of the idea of biography, and that there's the death of the object, and I'm sure many people would disagree with this here, but that when you place objects that have sort of multi-sensory experiences in some museum environment where they're taken away, that what happens is that the object dies to some degree. And there are lots of arguments mounted against that the object can easily be revived, and that this isn't like a point of finality. But it's so interesting that when we see something encased like that, that we're very aware. I mean, when you spoke so beautifully about your Kulnon, but that they call for touch in the way that you see them ridged, and that you kind of can very easily imagine you engaging with them in a sensory way that is not possible when they're framed like that. And that's an important part of the discourse, and that their ongoing history that is worthwhile observing, and that presumably won't be erased in future phases of their existence. It will always be something worth discussing in relation to these objects. I don't have anything to say about my own object.
Mark, did you have a
No, I
question?
think that's, exactly the point of those kinds of installations. They do represent a kind of elegant failure, but, they point to the ceremonies that never were, the ceremonies that never could be, because they have been housed in these museum collections, and for it, in its for local communities to kind of, when we put on display, it was renamed, it was given the Torres Strait name. So returning that cultural authority, even despite that absence of 100 years.
So can I just follow, in a way, I want to follow up two comments that you've made here. One about the Royal Collection Trust being a very problematic institution, which it most certainly is. But if we could, it's easy to pick on them, right? Poor Windsors or whatever. But I do think, Stephen, you spoke so eloquently about sort of pain which endures and violence and loss. And, this is not something which museums are particularly happy, except in small doses, to engage with. So I suppose my question is, what kind of, we at the University of Sydney are creating a new museum. There are massive museum projects all over. And in a way, what kind of museology or what kind of sensitive community response to the object could there be? You've reanimated, I remember, W.J.T. Mitchell being laughed out of court for his "what do pictures want?" But you've been asking, what do objects want? What should we be doing to honour them, to think about what is... So that's, I suppose, the question. In some ideal environment, what would be the way that you would pursue your really interesting but very difficult curatorial strategy at a larger scale?
No, thanks for that. I think one of the things we need to do is, or understand is, this is just an extension of Indigenous critical care, and so allowing Indigenous people to participate in the maintenance of that critical care. So having Indigenous curators is really important, but, the exhibition that I did was about time, but it's also about power. And curation is about caring for objects, caring for audiences, but it's also about control. And sometimes I think we need to give up some kinds of control. The museum needs to give up control to be open to things like touch, to be open to things like allowing Indigenous curators or Indigenous people to be vulnerable in these places. But, they do represent or have historically represented loss, but they don't always have to represent loss. Things can be recommissioned, things can be reanimated, things can be renewed. And so, that's what I would like to see, much more kind of fluid exchange. And that's hard to kind of negotiate those power dynamics that are, sometimes so ossified in many institutions. But that's what's at stake for Indigenous people. This is about the call and response to these objects.
So I guess I don't want to run the Windsors down because I think the curators who I met are doing kind of really amazing work. And one of the ways that we got access, I guess, to the Royal Collection was that we were working on another project around reinterpreting Queen Victoria, which was really influenced by sort of Indigenous kind of engagements with Queen Victoria. So I think there's a real sort of openness to new approaches. I suppose I'm not coming at it as a curator, but much more as a sort of straight historian, actually. And one of the things that I would like to see are some of these more fraught and ambivalent histories if it's within just the online database. And so I guess what I was trying to say is we've done pretty well through a whole lot of research to get shell work very visible, people recognising it. But we've also produced, I think, a kind of fairly stripped out account of it, which is coming out of particular eras, which was the kind of emphasis on it as commodity and craft and making and markets in a way, which I think has been really important, and that has come out of community engagement. But now I suppose I want to broaden that out to say what other work is it doing within other projects in Australia, which we can forget. So I think we're very good at forgetting aspects of our past, and I think objects provide us kind of with a means to go back into those pasts, perhaps in a way that other historical sources don't. I mean, some of the archival stuff does, but objects really, have that power, I suppose, too. So I guess my interest was, how can I put that little pair back in its time and place, and then work backwards and forwards again, and to be, I think, vigilant about responding to the ways in which they're taken up. And so I am concerned about the Women's Weekly. I think, someone's going to call them to account. Yeah.
I don't have a huge amount to say on that, other than to underline something that both Maria and Stephen have said. But the idea of involving communities, I think, is really important, certainly in the project that I'm working on, which doesn't carry the same kind of weight as it does with either of the other two research projects. But that it's been very important to have people that are, and I hate the word, but that are stakeholders, that are somehow involved in the various histories of these objects, to come into contact with one another, to have the opportunities to speak to one another, and to determine how it's meaningful for them and how they may care. Because this is a privately owned object that doesn't have like a trained curator being responsible for it, and the owners are very much taken by the idea of restoration, but that they don't necessarily have anybody to guide them about what that might mean or the most appropriate way to do it. So I think having an open dialogue, having representation in a variety of forms, including through scholarship, which I think is incredibly important, obviously, is an essential ingredient in determining how we would get to the point that is at the heart of your question.
We have time for one more question. Please.
This is rather like Mark's previous question, but a little more abstract. Stephen, you spoke about the ethnographic present. I think we can also talk about a museal present and a digital present. And given that there seems to be an abandonment of a linear and diachronic presentation in our institutions, how in the selfie age, what languages and what technologies can we use to convey a sense of deep history, of the passage of time, of the fact that this item comes from 1927, that this item comes from the 1880s?
What I missed out of the presentation was, I was a bit unkind to anthropology, but, some of my best friends are anthropologists. But I'm also really interested in this category of the contemporary, not as a ringing endorsement, but that it's also a possibility for Indigenous art and culture to occupy both positions simultaneously. So I was really interested in that multiplicity of time and histories and and I think people, I think those kinds of displays are really important, and I think people are much more, definitely with the students that we teach at University of Sydney, they're, able to handle that kind of a narrative, that things are, to apprehend the totality and complexity of objects, that we need to think of them as existing in multiple spaces and times. I think, we need, our museums are already doing these kinds of hangs, but, maybe, I remember Mark Ledbury talking about, the business of art history is like the business of categorizing, into these temporal periods, into these nation states and things like that. And we also have to think much more fluidly about those categories. We are reproducing them as well in our own versions of art history. even the art history that I perform, or I think I perform, is anthropologically informed as well. So, it is multidisciplinary and, open to these extra discursive significations of works.
Probably not, but I guess just to say, to follow on from what you're saying, is the temporality of art history, I suppose. So one of the reasons I sort of wanted to pick up Margaret Preston, and then if you look at sort of archivally around descriptions of shell work from, say, 1900, 1910, it's already speaking in a sort of aesthetic language. Here is an art form. And somehow she takes it up and eclipses that, I suppose, again. So, yes, I sort of agree we need a sort of deep time, but we also need a kind of sense of this repetition about what keeps dropping out. And I guess I'm sort of influenced there much more around a sort of a memory studies approach, which allows us to see these sort of unusual patterns of remembering and forgetting and reproduction, that the kind of work of working with objects is to sort of butt back up against that as a kind of an occasion to sort of retrieve, not lost, I suppose, but the ways in which things kind of go in and out of view. I don't know if that answers. I don't know if it answers deep time. I suppose shell work is unusual in that way, is that people have tried to tell a kind of history of it which would connect it in a much more deep time. I guess I've been much more focused on its colonial.
It's certainly that idea has been something that has driven the way that I've approached my project. I think one of the difficulties in working with kind of within a design history is that so often the idea of, and there's certainly important categories, but like the conception, style, and the manufacture or materiality of the object is the thing that exclusively dominates, and that things aren't discussed outside of those terms very frequently. And that you lose certain kinds of objects, then kind of how I started at the introduction to my paper, saying, well, it is and isn't significant, depending on how you set up the kind of criteria by which you're going to evaluate it. And so the kind of, the nature of art history is sort of classification. And I suppose I've been led by some of the excellent work that my colleagues like Stephen and Mark Ledbury have been doing around object-focused studies that don't locate the object in a fixed way within some rigid, predetermined system of analysis, but that let the object determine how it is going to be analysed itself. Like I think Priya mentioned aperture eye, and just follow the thing itself, and it will determine how you should pursue it, which doesn't always work out, but it certainly can. Is a very important way of approaching certainly the histories of objects that have contested histories or that don't fit into like canonical narratives within whatever discipline it is, and that they can be revived in that sense by determining a way of approaching them that is particular to them as opposed to something that is disciplinary oriented or grounded within the discipline. Technology I have nothing to say about. You saw my PowerPoint now.
That brings us up to our break time. Please join me in thanking Stephen, Maria and Mark for 3 really thoughtful and engaging papers.